This is the Depth Mystic Community Podcast, episode 53. And this week, we have two topics that aren't really depth mystical related at all. The first one is the question of intentional communities and the need for tribe in modern life, and the fact that people just don't have tribes. Of course, with me, as always, is depth mystic Zach Tolan. And so we're going to have a conversation, but it's definitely not even within his area of expertise. As podcast host, I could just as easily hold the entire conversation myself. But let's turn it over to Jungian depth mystic Zach Tolan and see what he has to say about this subject matter. Hello. Good to see you again this week, podcast host Zach Tolan. I'm so glad to have been introduced with such honors. But I guess I will mention I was surfing the internet and I have stumbled across a very astute innovator who has set up a website called Retribalize.org or .ai if you want to join the social media club. Oh yeah, so what's going on with this guy? Basically, he sends me a newsletter every week or so and makes videos. And what stands out about this guy is he's breaking through a lot of the barriers that I and probably many, many other people have when trying to figure out how to get a tribe or a village in the modern world. Because it's probably 100 times easier to recognize the need for a tribe or to want to live in a better community, a village, to be within walking distance of a bunch of like-minded people. It's 100 times easier to recognize the need for it than it is to figure out how to actually do it. And so I really appreciate this particular influencer who figured out how to cut through a lot of the sticking points. And certainly many of the sticking points, he'll name them by name. Like, he just sent out a recent newsletter, and the title was, Inner Work is Not Enough. Oh yeah, that's pretty bold of him to say. I mean, maybe that does touch a sore spot for you. Yeah, because inner work is one of the touchstones of Jungian psychology. One of my big heroes, Robert A. Johnson, one of his most influential books is called Inner Work. And in the 1980s, when that book came out, this was pioneering stuff. People had not yet recognized totally and sufficiently the need to do inner work in our society. And so about 40 years ago, this was really actually new subject matter. But this guy on retribalize.org, he's an extrovert, and extroverts solve problems in the real world. And they don't succumb to the temptation to do just inner work. Like, they recognize they want to actually live life. And so his newsletter's like, inner work is not enough. And he talks about how he knew a guy who basically lived in the woods or something for like 10 years in a row. And he said he's probably not met more than 10 women during the entire 10 years he's lived in the woods. And he says, this guy has done more inner work than anybody I know. And the rest of the website talks about, okay, so there's lots of people, in particular introverts, who have a whole bunch of different aspirations, including, admittedly, myself. My ideal life would be to be a sort of Zen master or a spiritual master, whatever adjective you apply to the kind of master that I want to be. But Sue was sort of in a spiritual school, helping people become more aware, helping them become more conscious. It's kind of like a socialized form of therapy, because sometimes therapy, one-on-one therapy, it's very popular, but maybe you don't just need inner work. Maybe you need a community. You need a whole community. That's the only thing that's actually going to make you healthy. And so this guy is sort of cutting through and trying to figure out how do you actually do that in the world? Not how do you fantasize about it, but what are the real sticking points between where you are and where you need to go in terms of finding like-minded people. Yeah, it's kind of cool that you're a depth mystic, but you don't think the only thing people need to do is inner work. You're literally talking about this guy who's coming out and saying inner work is not enough. That's kind of rare for somebody like yourself to admit that somebody else has a big piece of the puzzle. Well, I mean, in my world, a depth mystic is somebody who tells the truth. I'm more aligned with wanting to talk about what's true and important than wanting to be the sole possessor of what's true and important. In other words, I'm an honorable person with integrity. And integrity demands that if somebody else has something you don't have, you defer to it, or at least you admit to it. This isn't just the Depth Mystic community podcast featuring Jungian depth mystic Zach Tolan. This is a podcast with genuine integrity, because it's much better for a thing to have integrity than to have anything else, really. Yeah, and that actually does correspond in Jungian psychology. Integrity means you're aligned with the archetype of wholeness, which is sort of the greater self, the God archetype. Anybody who is technically aligned with the archetype of wholeness should be able to defer to wisdom when they find it, even if it's not their little corner of the world. Okay, so what else do you want to say about Retribalize.org and the founder? Well, he's a young guy and he looks kind of like a hippie. He presents kind of like a hippie. And so it's not in the way he presents that wins him over in terms of what's compelling about him. It's what he says and how he is accomplishing his thing. He has his own little tribe. He's got a bunch of guys and he lives with them, or I don't even know what it is, like a village compound or a commune or something like that. Because there are a lot of hiccups. There's a lot of little hang-ups that if you really want to do something in the world, like as an introvert, you can fantasize all you want. But if you really want to do something in the world, you're going to find there are just factual barriers that you have to overcome. And this guy is very clever in identifying them and pointing them out, far more than anyone else that I've found, in terms of what it will really take to form a village. And beyond that, I would just refer people to that website and to get onto his thing if they're interested in how do you really form community? What is it really going to take in this world? Because I don't have the community that I want. I have not assembled my ideal commune or, retreat center. Okay, now we have one other topic for this week, which I also think has nothing to do with depth mysticism, but it seems like an important idea. And so it has to do with this question: why doesn't Congress work? So, depth mystic Zach Tolan, why doesn't Congress work? Yeah, we're talking about the United States Congress, the House of Representatives in particular. It's because the tribal grouping associated with each congressional district has no natural center in the human psyche. Like if you're trying to say, what do you belong to? Very few people will, even in their top 25 things, what they say they belong to, mention the specific congressional district that they live in. And so if you run for Congress for a congressional district, and what you need are the votes of the people in that district in order to get in, but those people don't have any sense of tribal unity, like what do I have in common with all the other people in my congressional district, life-wise, in terms of representation? If I'm trying to be represented in a governing body that influences the world and matters, how do you represent the people of a specific congressional district over, say, an industry? Suppose you work in the oil industry. Everyone else who works in the oil industry will have a sense of shared identity with you, and they will be able to unite and advocate for the oil industry more coherently than they can unite and advocate for the other people who happen to live in their congressional district. Likewise, If I live in a city, like the city of Philadelphia, I can identify as a Philadelphian and have some communal sense of the common bond that I share with the people in that city. Geographically, it's easier to unite around identity with somewhere that has, skyscrapers and a city hall and stuff like that than it is a congressional district, which it has just a bunch of more or less random cities or maybe part of one city. Now, maybe there's some congressional districts that map nicely over the city that you live in and therefore are able to identify with as a social unit. But it's pretty rare. Now, likewise, with a political philosophy or a religion, an ideology of some kind, suppose you're an evangelical Christian and you're one of the evangelical Christians who thinks they should assert themselves politically in one way or another. Well, you'll be able to unite with other evangelical Christians and to promote your agenda in that way much more easily than you can unite with the other people in your congressional district to promote the agenda of the people in that congressional district. People have these internal apparatuses for feeling connected and community with different groups of people. Like naturally, when you're born into your family, you have a really strong sense of communion with your family. And then when you go to school, and then your school football team goes and plays the other school football team, you can cheer for your team because you have some sense of connection with your school, even if you've only been there a year or two. It's not that hard to form a sense of connection with a bunch of people you spend hours every day with, even if you don't talk to most of them. But a congressional district, a line sort of more or less arbitrarily drawn on a map in order to include a precise number of people, there are no basic human instincts that allow one to feel a sense of kinship and common purpose with an arbitrarily drawn district on a map. And that's why Congress is so easily corruptible. First of all, if you run for Congress, it's not because you have some kind of weird sympathy for the people who happen to inhabit the arbitrarily drawn line on the map. It's more of like an ego trip. Or, maybe you have ideas of who you really can serve. And I'll even go further and say a lot of the best service a congressperson can do for the people in that regional area doesn't actually have much to do with the people in that regional area, since maybe the best laws for our country ought to apply to the whole country. Like the best thing you can do for the whole country is to pass good laws that benefit the whole country or something. And so at least half of the job of somebody in Congress, in my opinion, is to ignore their own congressional district and focus on where the most good can be done, even if it doesn't specifically target the people of their district. For example, there's a thing called pork in Congress where in order to get a congressperson to sign a bill, you offer the people of their congressional district something or other. But it's commonly understood that if you add enough pork to a bill in order to get a bill passed, then you're doing all of these favors individually for all those congresspeople, but you're actually dragging the whole country down because you had to do all those favors. In other words, you're too selfish. Like the congresspeople are too selfishly serving only their own district, which is making the whole country worse. And so I think in order to be like a really good congressperson, you have to understand that the good of your own people requires eliminating pork from everybody's bill frequently. I'm not saying you can't also serve the people of your district, but I'm saying when you have a narrow-minded focus like that, you become very petty and it's easy to lose track of what really ought to be done, like the best laws that really ought to be passed for everybody. So you're actually doing your own people a disservice by trying to get special favors for them in many cases. Okay, well, that is a very good argument that you just made. And I guess what you're saying is that you need to feel a sense of true kinship with whatever group you're a part of and whatever you're advocating for. And you'll be much more effective if you do. And that you can't just assume that the existing structures make that kinship real. So what do you think we should do if Congress is sort of inherently dysfunctional based on what you're saying? That only a very small percentage of your natural tendency to advocate actually matches the group of people who you're assigned to advocate for? That's a good question. We can start by talking about it. We can start by acknowledging there's a problem. Because that's one of the main reasons Congress people are so easily bought, is that there isn't any natural part of them that understands who it is they're serving. And so if somebody in Washington, D.C. wants to take them out for a nice steak dinner, it's easy for almost all the Congress people to just think, oh, well, they seem convincing and passionate. They've convinced me that they're doing good for my district. But that's because you don't have a natural archetype in the human psyche that tells you what it means to serve a congressional district. Yeah, but what do you think we should do? At minimum, we need to start acknowledging this. If we're going to have a kind of an honest situation going on with our government that isn't just a corrupt, ineffective, cynical situation, then at minimum, we need an honest dialogue and understanding of how power actually works and how people actually work. If you need representation, you need people who are actually going to represent you somehow. And you need to know if there's a flaw in the system that makes it very hard for the people who are supposed to represent you to actually do that. We need to discuss all of these things. This has been the Depth Mystic Community Podcast, episode 53. And that's it for this week. I'll see you next week.